Tiny homes have become incredibly popular over the last decade. But if you look closely at most of them, they tend to fall into two categories. Either they feel like a trailer, or they feel like a miniature version of a suburban house. And neither one of those really feels like architecture to me. So I wanted to explore a slightly different idea. What would happen if an architect sat down and tried to design the ultimate small cabin from scratch? Not just something compact, but something thoughtful, something simple, a building that feels calm and intentional, and that sits comfortably in the landscape around it. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to design a small, Scandinavian-inspired cabin. Just a living space, a kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. 4 simple spaces, organized into one long building that sits quietly in the landscape. And I'm curious about something before we get too far into this. When you picture your ideal cabin, what does it look like? Is it something tiny and tucked in the woods, or something a little more open and with big views? Let me know in the comments, because I always find it interesting how differently people imagine these spaces. So whenever I start a project like this, the first thing I try to do is resist the temptation to make it more complicated than it needs to be. It's very easy to start adding things. Extra shapes, extra rooms, little design gestures that seem interesting in the moment, but small buildings rarely benefit from that kind of complexity. In fact, the smaller the building is, the more important simplicity becomes. So the design begins with the simplest possible move, a rectangle. This cabin is organized as a long, narrow footprint, and that proportion actually matters more than people might expect. Long buildings tend to feel more elegant than square ones, even when they're small. They also help the interior feel larger because the eye can travel through the length of the building instead of immediately hitting a wall. So the plan becomes a single bar of space. At one end of the cabin is the main living area. This is where most of the time would be spent. Right next to that is that compact kitchen where you would cook your meals. In small buildings, circulation needs to stay very efficient. Instead of carving out a ton of hallways, the spaces simply flow into each other. The kitchen becomes part of the larger living space rather than its own separate room. And beyond the kitchen is the bedroom. Even though the cabin is small, it's still nice for the sleeping area to feel a little more private. So I placed it further down the building where things become quieter and a bit more removed from the living space. And somewhere in the middle, and the shared plumbing wall with the kitchen, is a small bathroom. By organizing these rooms in this sequence, the plan stays very efficient. Nothing's wasted, and every square foot is doing something useful. When you're working in a small building like this, proportions start to matter a lot. A few feet one way or another can completely change how the space feels. How large should the living area be so that it feels comfortable and not oversized? How compact can the kitchen become while still being usable? How much separation does the bedroom really need? These are the kind of things that slowly shape the plan. The goal isn't just to squeeze the rooms inside the footprint. The goal is to make the spaces feel intentional, even though the building itself is fairly modest. One small move that helps a lot in cabin design is the addition of a porch. Instead of making the interior larger, the roof simply extends outward a bit at the front of the building. That creates a small, covered outdoor space. It's a simple move, but it adds a lot to the experience of the cabin. The porch becomes kind of a threshold between the landscape and the interior. A place to sit when it's raining, or drink warm coffee in the morning, or just pause before going inside. And because the roof structure already exists, extending it a little bit is a very efficient way to add a meaningful space without making the building more complicated. And honestly, that's one of my favorite things about cabins. They often blur the line between inside and outside. Once the plan begins to feel right, the next step is thinking about the overall form of the building. And again, the idea here is restraint. The entire cabin is defined by a single gable roof. No dormers, no complicated intersections, no extra shapes fighting for attention. Just one clean roofline running from one end of the building to the other. What makes this form interesting also is how the roof meets the walls. Instead of stopping at the eave and switching to a completely different surface, the roof plane continues downwards and becomes the exterior walls. The result is a very simple silhouette, almost like a folded shape resting in the landscape. At this point, I usually do a quick perspective sketch, not because it needs to be perfect, but because it helps me understand the character of the building. How tall should the roof feel? How strong should the proportions be? Does the building feel calm and balanced when it sits in the landscape? Even these rough sketches, they can answer those questions. Once the basic idea feels solid on paper, the next step is moving into the digital world. This is where the proportions really start to get tested. Sometimes something that looks great in a sketch needs a small adjustment once it exists in 3 dimensions. A wall might shift a little, a window might move, the roof height maybe needs to change slightly. So the first thing I model is simply the mass of the building. Start with the walls, build a long rectangle, and start putting the rooms in there. Maybe add the small porch extension and the other elements that will fill in the space. From there, the model slowly starts to develop. Windows get added, interior walls begin defining more rooms. Openings are adjusted to frame views and bring natural light into the space. Small cabins benefit from restraint. Too many materials or too many shapes can quickly make a building feel cluttered. So the focus stays on clarity. One strong form, a limited palette of materials, and windows placed carefully instead of randomly. As I'm working through the modeling, I'm really thinking about how the interior spaces will actually feel. Even though the cabin is compact, it still needs to be comfortable. The living area is designed to feel open and relaxed. Large windows will help connect the interior to the landscape outside, bringing light and views into the space. The kitchen stays efficient and understated, just enough room to cook and prepare meals without dominating the main room. The final decision that really shapes the character of the cabin, though, is the exterior materials. Outside of the building is going to be finished in dark cladding. In colder climates, darker materials can actually help absorb the heat from the sun, which makes them a practical choice. But visually, they also do something interesting. The darker surface helps the building settle into the landscape instead of standing out against it. Rather than competing with the scenery, the cabin becomes part of it. So once the design is fully modeled, it's time to see how the building actually feels in its setting. The renderings will help bring everything together. You can see the long proportions of the cabin, the simple roofline, and the way the building sits quietly within the open landscape. There's nothing overly complicated about it, just a small building with a clear architectural idea. As you approach the cabin, the first thing you encounter is that small covered porch. It's a simple space, but it sets the tone for the building. A place where the outside and the inside begin to overlap. From there, the door opens into the main living area. The room itself isn't huge, but the long proportions and generous windows help it feel open and connected to the landscape beyond. The kitchen sits within the space, integrated into a larger room so that cooking and living can happen together. Moving farther down the cabin, the bedroom becomes a quieter retreat, a place to rest. The entire cabin really comes back to one idea: simplicity. Small buildings don't need to be elaborate to feel meaningful. With careful proportions and a clear architectural idea, even the modest structure can feel intentional. But I'm curious what you think. Would you live in a cabin like this? Or if you were designing your own small cabin, what would you change? Would you make it smaller or bigger, add a loft, maybe move the bedroom somewhere else? Let me know in the comments, because hearing how other people imagine these spaces is always one of the most interesting parts of me sharing my designs. And if you enjoy seeing these kinds of architectural ideas come to life, there's plenty of other projects on this channel, so make sure you subscribe. And as always, stay curious and design with intent.